When King Saul looked out over the valley, all he could see was Goliath. He saw a man over 9 feet tall. He saw the armor. He saw impossibility. He saw a man whose muscles were bigger than his, whose skills were sharper than his, whose bravery was bolder than his. And Saul was very self-conscious because he stood a full head and shoulders taller than everyone else. In his land, he was the giant. And so when the Philistine giant came out and challenged the men of Israel to fight him one-on-one, everyone looked at Saul. And Saul looked down, and Saul looked around, and Saul looked at Goliath. But Saul did not look up. And for 40 days, Goliath came out, and he abused King Saul. He abused God's army. He abused God himself. And then David shows up. David did not come prepared to fight a battle. He came to deliver some food. He came in the role as a servant, much like Jesus. And when David heard the cursing and the foul mouth of Goliath, he said, "What's going on here? Who is this guy?" And then the army shows us how they have followed the leadership of Saul. They talk about Goliath's armor, and they talk about how strong he is, and they talk about the rewards that King Saul will give to overcome the giant. You see, everyone in the army who was afraid, everyone in the army who hadn't stepped up, was thinking about consequences. They were thinking about rewards, or maybe dying, or being maimed for life. But David wasn't thinking about either of those things. In fact, when he talks about Goliath, he uses certain terms that show that Goliath is a pagan man, that Goliath is not part of God's people. See, he's looking at it through a different perspective. So when Saul calls David into his tent and he says, "You can't fight him, you're just a kid, you don't know what you're doing," David doesn't talk about himself. He doesn't say, "Well, I'm pretty good with a sling, I've been practicing." He doesn't say, "Well, I'm pretty quick, I'm young, I'm strong, I'm brave." He says, "God's got this." He talks about how God had delivered him from a bear and from a lion, and how God had given him victory in the past. You see, David's confidence didn't come from his victories. It came from the source of his victories. David knew that he had won in the past because God had been there for him. So when David's older brother, who put him down in front of everyone, David didn't defend himself. He was thinking about God's honor. When King Saul said, "You can't do this," okay, fine, here, wear all my armor. David didn't get into a conflict with Saul. He talked about God. And then when David goes out there and confronts the giant, first he had to overcome his brother, and then the king, and now he's facing the giant. When Goliath calls him a dog, he says, "Oh, am I a dog that you come at me?" He's talking about a homosexual male shrine prostitute. So he's saying, this is the biggest insult ever, that you would come out here at me. He is attacking David's very manhood. And David doesn't defend himself. David says, "You come at me with," and he starts talking about all the things that the men behind him were thinking about. Your sword and your spear. I mean, it was 2-on-1. You had the giant and his armor bearer. And David was letting everyone in the army behind him know, this is what you've got. And that's nothing. Because I come at you in the name of the Lord Almighty, whom you have defied. You see, David was talking to Goliath, but he was also talking to his brother. He was talking to his king. He was talking to the men who he would one day lead into battle. And he was saying, the battle is the Lord's. It doesn't matter how big you are. It doesn't matter that you seem to have all the advantages. You've got nothing on my God. And then it says that Goliath came at David with a roar of anger. And the Bible is very clear. It says David ran towards Goliath. He didn't pray. He didn't run away. He didn't drop to his knees. He didn't hesitate. He ran towards Goliath. That's faith. That's knowing that the battle has already been won. You see, in our world today, there's so much that we can look at that's like Goliath. There's so many things we can look at that get us stressed out and afraid. We can look at ourselves and see all of our weaknesses as insecurities. We can look at what's going on in the political world and just imagine what might happen in November. We could imagine what will happen if the virus gets worse or if the fires keep going. There's so many giants in our lives that can freak us out. I'm sure you've got personal giants in your life, personal problems that no one else really knows about, or maybe even they don't even care about, but you care about them and they're overwhelming you. And today we are to be like David. Don't look at the giant and think, oh my goodness, this guy's so big. Look at your God. And then look at the giant and be like, you don't stand a chance. You see, we want to dictate what God does. We want God to give us the victory of David. And God will at just the right time. You see, before David had the victory over Goliath, he was a shepherd boy. He was left out in the fields when the prophet Samuel came to his hometown. He was sent to the battle, not with a sword in his hand, but with a bag of cheese and bread. You see, David went through the humiliation or the humble tasks, the small tasks. I mean, taking care of sheep. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to do that. But David was faithful in the little things. And in those little things, he learned that he could trust God in the little things. He could trust God doing his job. He could trust God fighting an animal. He could trust God knowing that his timing would be okay. David didn't show up when Samuel anointed him with oil to become the next king of Israel. He didn't show up because he figured it out and he manipulated the situation and he said the right things. No, God called him through Samuel from the fields to the feast. And it's the same with you. Right now, you might be doing a little job. You might be doing something that you feel is unimportant. You might be saying, I don't think God's using me at all. You might be feeling like you are just knocked flat on your back. You're facing financial troubles or sicknesses or just the stress of the world. You're like, this is impossible. There's no way for me to win. But I just want to encourage you to look at the story of David. He knew he would be victorious because he knew the battle wasn't his. He's like, yeah, God will take care of this. Oh, I'll just use a stick, a stone, and a sling. I'll take this guy out. Everyone else was looking at the sword and the armor. But David was looking up. And that's the secret to being fearless. See, Saul was king and David was a shepherd. Saul was taller and bigger and David couldn't even fit into his armor. Saul had the training and David had nothing. Saul had the army behind him and David had sheep. Saul had everything going for him, yet he could not face the giant. David had nothing really going for him, except he trusted in God. And God makes all the difference. And so the reason we're doing this devotional, the reason I wrote the book Fearless, and it's going to come out very soon, the reason we spend time in our Bibles and go to church and pray with each other is not to somehow earn brownie points with God. It's to cement in our own minds that God's got this, that we can trust in Him, that no matter what happens in the world or in our homes or in our bodies or in our minds or in our environment, that God is bigger and we can trust in Him. God loves you very much, and He's got a plan for you that's just as glorious and important as the plan that He had for King David. He just wants you to step into trusting in Him so you can step into your destiny. God's got this, and He loves you. God bless.